Looking for the perfect rental? Discover top-rated stays loved by guests, rated highest by real guests through authentic reviews. These traveler-loved stays are recognized by the details that matter most and validated by real experiences. Choose confidently from rentals you can trust. Vrbo. Book now a vacation rental loved by guests.
Welcome again to the Explaining History podcast, and I'm very honoured today to be joined by cultural historian Murray Pittock. We're here to talk about Scotland. Scotland, we talk about comparatively not very often on the podcast. And Murray's new book, The Shortest History of Scotland, which is a part of a Shortest History series, and manages to kind of compress a couple of millennia of history into a neat 200-page summary. So let's begin a little bit. Firstly, thanks for joining us, Murray. It's nice to have you today. Firstly, let's just talk about the book and where it originated from and the ideas behind it.
Well, I agreed to do this as part of the Shortest History series for a number of reasons. Two of them were that a lot of the one-volume histories of Scotland are either rather long and heavy or rather out of date or written by non-historians or some combination of all three. So there was an opportunity in the market from the point of view of a book which will familiarize people with a history with which they might otherwise be unfamiliar. And I won't deny that the other reason was that the Shortest History of England had sold 250,000 copies at the time that I signed the contract for this. So there were, as I say, a number of reasons. The aim of the book was fundamentally to give people a full insight into Scottish history, to make sure that history wasn't limited to kings and battles and pure narrative, but gave a sense of people's lived lives, culture, and built another environment through the ages, and to shape it in a way which made enabled people to make sense of Scotland in the post-war and the contemporary era, and how we got to where we are, and also to give them some small parts of the book which show depths that they might want to read into further. For example, round about the Declaration of Arbroath. So if people do get the bug for reading more Scottish history, there's some signposts within the book itself as to areas they might want to explore further.
And for a kind of a relatively concise book, were there kind of key themes that kind of that you focused on, and key sort of issues and historical processes that you focused on?
Well, I wanted to focus on primarily on how Scotland came to become a state in historical time, and in that sense, I used, and it's a quote from Walter Scott, "the land of the mountain and the flood," as the guiding metaphor, because I think it's very easy in the way we live now to underestimate the extent to which the geographical terrain of Scotland made it virtually impenetrable until modern road and rail transport. Even as late as 1740, Lord Lovat took 6 weeks to get from Inverness to London by coach. And that was, a member of the elite. Bringing an army into Scotland was an extremely difficult task. And basically, the only way you could do it and keep them supplied was to go up the East Coast.
Right, right. I always remember I did my undergraduate degree in Aberdeen many, many years ago, and the professor at the time, his argument was in the Middle Ages, the seas were the highways, seas and rivers, and the land was extremely difficult to navigate, as you mentioned. And what we see as now being a difficult mode of transport actually was how you got around. And so the coasts, Scotland's coasts, were kind of alive with nautical travel.
That's absolutely right. But that wasn't Alan McInnes, by the way, was it? But
It might well have been, in fact.
but I mean, Aberdeen is about the same distance from the Elbe as it is from the Thames, but the Elbe was in most respects easier to get to in 1500.
Sure, sure. Maybe still is. With we were just before we began recording today, we were just discussing the kind of very interesting context that Wales, where I live, and Scotland, where Murray is speaking from today, find themselves in, and of course Northern Ireland as well. The three Celtic parts of the United Kingdom have all now have nationalist majorities, political majorities, and I guess if we're speaking about Scotland, the kind of the story of Scottish nationalism really is kind of begins in am I right in thinking in the late 60s, early 70s? Is that correct?
The story of modern Scottish nationalism.
Yes.
Yeah, that's I would say there's quite a lot of Scottish nationalism evident in the 50 years after the Union associated with the Jacobites. But modern Scottish nationalism, starts from Winnie Ewing's victory in the 1967 Hamilton by-election. And the interesting thing was that one of her slogans, and it was used in her acceptance speech when she won Hamilton, was "Stop the world, Scotland wants to get on." So the perceived marginalization of Scotland in the post-imperial era was one of the key drivers of modern Scottish nationalism. That instead of being Scottish and British, Canadian and British, New Zealand and British, Australian and British, you suddenly, almost overnight, became British. and British identity was something which looked like special pleading, whereas previously it had been quite normative.
This is a really interesting area, and I always remember there was a great book written in about 2014 by David Reynolds, The Long Shadow, and all about the historical memory of the First World War. And in it, he writes in one of the later chapters, he talks about the Union, and he says in his argument is the two world wars and the Cold War afterwards kind of give the Union almost like a natural longevity, because you have people who from all parts of the Union who fought under a British flag and swore an oath of loyalty to King George, and maybe, in the post-war decades, maybe didn't like the English very much, but their thought was, well, there was this national enterprise we were kind of part of, and that as that generation begins to sort of die away, probably from the 70s, the 80s to the 90s onwards, you get less of that kind of emotional commitment to the Union. And I just wonder, it's always stuck with me as an argument. And I wonder what you make of that. Is there something in that, do you think?
Well, certainly the two world wars were occasions of solidarity, but I think there is more, and that solidarity, I think, held back or quite a lot of processes. Actually, society in the late 30s was as liberal and dynamic as society was not to be again till the verge of the 60s. So it held back a lot of social changes in the UK as a whole, as well as any political ones. But I think it's a deeper thing here, which is that if you look at, say, the 1938 Empire Exhibition in Glasgow, the last Empire Exhibition, 12.6 million visitors, national, presented as a Scottish national event, national pavilion for Scotland, whole range of material clearly identifying Scotland as one of the nations of the British Empire. If you compare that with the Festival of Britain in 1951, where the theme and the closing song was Jerusalem,
Yeah.
and although there were regional events, almost everything took place in London, and the Welsh section was entirely Anglophone. All of this, and where Britain was, suddenly there was no empire. You got for the first time, I mean, there was still a British Empire, but the Festival of Britain presented itself as the first festival where the empire had come home. So there was some acknowledgement of the Windrush
Yes.
generation and the multiculturalism of Britain in 1951. But there wasn't any real acknowledgement compared to 1938 of the internationals of Britain. And the other thing is that the memory of World War II, we won the war, we stood alone in 1940, all that kind of memory, was very much about an introspective national memory rather than an international one. And that has had really quite a significant impact. I mean, it's, no wonder people want to remember the Battle of Britain more than the fall of Singapore. But from the point of view of rubbing out the British Empire as the combatant in World War One and Two, and not Great Britain, a whole load of serious mistakes are made.
Yeah.
The number of British troops, even in the Eighth Army, was a minority in North Africa, and we get to a situation where the Commonwealth War Graves Commission about 5 years ago um, expressed strong concern that the sacrifice of the Indian war dead in World War One and Two was not sufficiently recognized because there's this habit of making everything as if it's all about the island. And that's so it's actually the way in which World War Two is remembered and the function World War Two has in the British psyche is every bit as important
Yeah.
as the solidarity created by the war itself.
And I think in the sort of the imaginarium of the particularly the year 1940, the way in which the kind of the crisis year of 1940 is remembered, it's remembered primarily as an English crisis. You know, the Battle of Britain is the Battle of the South Downs. It's fought, you know, the Blitz. I mean, Scottish cities were bombed, Welsh cities were bombed, but for the most part, that's kind of not completely edited from the narrative, but it's not front and center particularly.
No, it's a
Um,
London home county story. You're absolutely right about that.
yeah, yeah, um, and the kind of obviously the Scottish and Welsh and Irish contributions to victory, and also the hardships, rationing, and war work, and all these other things, quite evenly distributed. But it's a really kind of really English memory. Um, and I wonder there in you there are two kind of, I think, in Wales, two forms of in which kind of Welsh nationalism takes. There is the sort of the kind of a cultural Welsh nationalism around language, but also there is a kind of economic nationalism, a sense that we get a rubbish deal, and that Welsh resources are used and abused by England. Um, and I wonder, is that are those the kind of like the two drivers of Scottish nationalism? Do you think, sort of cultural and economic, or are there other aspects to it as well?
Um, I think it's a slightly different pattern. So I would say it's a mixture of economic, democratic control, which reflects really the fact that Scotland was functionally self-governing throughout its institutions. Uh, for a large part of the Union era, having all the large part of the institutions of the state remaining even after the Union, and professional organizations which had a role analogous to parliamentary ones, for example, the Faculty of Advocates. And also, there's an international dimension, which I think is a bit different, which is that is Scotland as a Scotland and Scotland, Scotland and British, as I say, no longer possible. It is possible, but no longer welcome and understood widely. Scotland has always responded to an outlet. And I think you could see that in the Brexit vote in 2016. The hugely different pattern of the vote in Scotland was a clear sign of the way in which Scots define themselves with an external organisation which is not primarily or necessarily or solely the United Kingdom.
Yeah. And I think that, you have in the British Isles, this kind of emergent Celtic nationalism.
Mm.
And to some extent, you see, particularly following the first Scottish independence referendum, for many people in England, I think that was the first time that it kind of really registered that there was a significant number of people in Scotland that did not want to be part of the Union any longer. And I don't know what effect maybe that had on the Brexit referendum, but I think the kind of a very chauvinistic English nationalism and a independence-led Celtic nationalisms sort of interplay with one another, and there's this sort of rather kind of there's this sort of movement for like kind of rights for the English, and David Cameron, I think, tried to introduce this idea of like kind of only English MPs can vote on English laws, which is sort of kind of a bit of a nonsense, really. And I think that it's hard to predict, how these nationalisms interplay with one another. But certainly, I think that a kind of the current iteration of English nationalism is certainly fueling and driving other Celtic nationalisms. So, sorry to go on, but
I think current English nationalism is fueling nationalism elsewhere. I'm not sure about the reverse being the case. What tended to happen, I mean, for example, happened in Ireland in 1922, is that suddenly, it suits both parties, of course, Ireland dropped out of British history like a stone. It was never there. and Britain dropped out of Irish history in much the same way. I mean, it's come back a bit now, but for a long time, there's these holes. So the power to forget what are sometimes called the Celtic fringes is very deeply embedded in the centre. So I'm not sure that there is much influence. There's much influence on them, but I think it's quite true that in 2014 people were very surprised that there was such a substantial vote for independence.
Yeah,
who had no knowledge or understanding of Scottish politics. They were rather shocked and in some cases upset by it. And there have been signs before, but people just didn't. It's never been discussed or never been properly looked at seriously by, for example, British Public Service Broadcasting or major media prior to the referendum campaign. I mean, when the exit polls came out in the devolution vote in 1997, they had a program from London, and it said, and the person presenting said, we got a lot of people saying that they'd rather vote for a separate state at the polls. Quite a surprising number, and it was just an anecdote. They didn't even put it in the data, though we think probably it was about a third of all those who voted for devolution, so about 25%. But they just regarded it as a bit surprising and moved on. So there was very little serious understanding and analysis, which is why it came as such a big surprise.
And to what extent? I mean, um, if you look at the kind of the economic argument, to what extent does the current um, generation of Scottish nationalist politicians uh, owe their success to the effects of Margaret Thatcher on Scotland?
Well, I think that's exaggerated myself. Well, Margaret Thatcher's ascendancy did not, after all, coincide with the recrudescence of Scottish nationalism. I mean, there was a slight recrudescence linked to the poll tax,
Right.
but it wasn't a period of strong nationalism. What it was a period of strong Labour nationalism with a small n, where the Labour Party in Scotland appeared to be a national patriotic party. And
Yeah.
probably, I think a significant part of the SNP's success after 1997 is down to the fact that, unlike, for example, in states or sub-state or nations or regions like Catalonia or Quebec, the Labour Party never instantly became, when devolution occurred, despite the efforts of people like Henry McLeish in the early years, a branch office, as it's been repeatedly called, of a British party. And so they failed. Jordi Pujol in Catalonia probably delayed a Catalan independence referendum by a generation because he presented as a patriot Catalan politician not seeking independence. Scottish Labour leaders have found it extremely difficult to present in that way. And since 2007, they seem to have given up the effort altogether.
And I mean, was the intent of devolution to try to stave off nationalist tensions? States rarely kind of decentralize for benign reasons. What was the kind of the grand strategy here, do you think?
I'm not sure that it would be nice to think there was a grand strategy. I think there wasn't. I think what happened was that Donald Dewar and Gordon Brown guilted Tony Blair into honoring John Smith's legacy, and so Blair agreed to legislation introduced by Dewar, which he didn't really care about, frankly, and wasn't very enthusiastic about and was didn't like the outcome of very much, but didn't exactly oppose it. So I think, and then of course, I think the devolution bill got watered down in the Commons anyway, insofar as to what was to be devolved. I don't think the UK and either major party ever actually understood what it was and what the constitutional changes that are created by it. And it's still the case that you can have, very much the case that you can have the BBC having headlines saying junior doctors strike, and they themselves are oblivious to the fact that a settlement's been reached in Scotland. And so that basic element of public sector broadcasting is repeatedly breached
Yeah.
by the BBC because they don't offer geographical coverage which reflects devolution, even though they've got guidelines about it. So that's all of those things really mean that the devolution settlement was nailed on to British government, not part a reason to change it or modernize it in other ways. Yes, Lord Robertson, particularly, of course, who said devolution would kill nationalism stone dead. The Labour Party expected it to kill nationalism stone dead, but the Labour Party failed to take the basic step of becoming a nationalist party themselves in order to try and achieve that goal, which was absolutely necessary for them to do.
There was this interesting conversation in Wales. Well, it's happening right now, and the answer is a resounding no. That the Welsh Labour Party, which has been decimated here in
Mm.
spectacular fashion, might cut its ties with the UK Labour Party and set itself up as as Welsh Labour. And now this thing, it comes round every so often. Will Labour do that? Because the Labour Party in Wales is generally more to the left of the Labour Party in Westminster, and they're never quite bold enough to give it a go. And I think actually probably they would do very well if they did, but I'm not taking massive political gambles, am I? So, but I guess it's similar to what you're saying there, that the Welsh the Scottish Labour Party never really took that leap.
No, indeed. But I think it was also within the purview of the UK Labour Party to take that leap itself. And what also became apparent quite early on was that MPs who in Scotland from the beginning had relatively little to do because of the amount of stuff that was devolved, um, looked down on MSPs, and there wasn't a commitment. A number of senior Labour figures went to the Scottish Parliament with Donald Dewar, but that quality was not maintained. And generally speaking, MPs who could go to representatives who could go to Westminster preferred that and were preferred by the Labour Party to take that route. And so that actually weakened the representation that they had, and it still does.
And when there was a referendum in 2014, the Leave vote lose, not by an enormous margin, but what was it you think that kind of drew a majority of people back, or majority of voters, shall we say, to the union? To what convinced them to stay?
I think the evidence is that it was anxiety primarily about pensions and currency,
Yeah.
which was critical in making the difference between a small majority and a small loss. That said, the situation is that 52% of those born in Scotland voted yes. So it's in a number of ways, it was very tight. And you also got the same situation as you got in the Brexit vote, whereby people who are younger tended to be much more strongly in favour of yes, and people who were older tended not to be.
And if I remember rightly, the SNP never quite made the case for what they would do with the currency. Did they? At some points they were talking about separating from the pound, and other points they backtracked and said, no, we would retain it. Is that a?
Yeah, it's they retain the pound in the short term, I think was the view. And of course, then Osborne said you won't be allowed to retain the pound, as if in fact you can't actually use pounds without the say-so of the UK Chancellor of the Exchequer, which is not the case. But of course, it was a weakness, and part of that weakness, and it's still, I think, a weakness for the SNP. Part of that weakness is that some significant number of senior figures in the SNP think that actually the solution is to have the euro circulate within Scotland. But the polling evidence suggests people don't want the euro, at least not the figures I've seen are about 30%. It's not a vote winner.
No.
So having an independent Scottish currency is more of a vote winner than the euro. But an independent Scottish currency brings all sorts of questions about the performance of such a currency in international securities markets and the willingness of people to deal in such a currency when other currencies are available to hold assets in.
Yes. Who will buy Scottish debt?
Yeah.
And that kind of thing. I mean, my thought always was, what a vengeful UK or rump UK government would do to Scotland if it continued to control the fiscal levers over it, and all sorts of stuff, I imagine. So it's a really, really difficult knot to unravel. And finally, I guess one thing, just to sort of hop backwards in time, I wanted to ask, and I should have done this at the start of our conversation, was about the formation of the union. And I'm always kind of curious about, in Scotland, who were the social groups, which classes kind of benefited from it. And you have to have a significant body of people thinking we're onto a winner there in order to accept it in the first place. But who got things out of the Union?
So some of the nobility got something out of the Union, but I think it would be fair to say at the time that the Union vote was forced, in the sense that Scotland was not performing economically well, partly due to its habit of fighting each other over matters of church government, partly due to the fact that it was caught by the adverse climate of the early modern period. It was general economic performance was worse in that respect, and partly by the England's refusal, even though the kingdoms were joined, to allow Scots to take part in English overseas markets, and indeed to effectively, as with the Darien scheme, to fail to support any Scottish ventures in overseas markets, while conjoint ventures could only be crewed effectively by English sailors. So there are a lot of the reasons that people voted for the Union are they didn't seem to be an alternative,
right?
Short of an armed rising in favor of the Stuarts, and that did come, and was going to come in 1708, but was scared off by the Royal Navy. So there was very little popular support for the Union. Almost all, large number of boroughs and organizations protested and petitioned against it, but there was sufficient support in the Scottish estates to get it through, partly by the advantaging of some people in what came afterwards, as indeed happens even today, I believe, in some parliamentary government, and also the fact that there didn't seem to be anywhere else to go.
Yeah.
Scotland couldn't function have an independent foreign policy, and couldn't functionally carry out overseas trade in the way it had been doing since the medieval period, let alone take advantage of the markets that are now opening up.
And there are some wonderful opportunities for kind of a Scottish kind of mercantile class to become involved in with the development of the British Empire.
Well, that did come, yeah. It wasn't absolutely apparent in 1707, though the potential was there, but that did come, and it also meant there was a change of balance in Scotland from east to west, because the easterly facing ports with the European trade tended to do worse over time, and the western ports, Glasgow in particular, with a focus on the American trade, did better.
Fantastic. Well, Murray, it's been really lovely to talk to you today. We'll finish there. So the book available currently in all good bookshops?
Shortest History of Scotland is available in all good bookshops. Yes, indeed. And it's going very well. It's the 4th best-selling title in Scotland currently. So it's a lot of people are lapping it up. So I hope any people can we can easily get it for £12 or £13. They know where to look. So
bargain at twice the price. And as we always say, if you can please buy it from a local independent book retailer, or if you can't get it.
Support for this podcast comes from Progressive, America's #1 boat insurer. We've all made mistakes on the water, but there's one mistake you shouldn't make: being uninsured. With Progressive Boat Insurance, you can choose coverage for most mistakes you or other boaters could make, helping you float carefree all season long. Quote today: Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. #1 rating based on 2024 filings with state departments of insurance.
Este episodio es presentado por Opill, la primera píldora anticonceptiva diaria de venta libre disponible en los Estados Unidos. Aprobada por la FDA de potencia completa y libre de estrógeno. Además, no necesitas receta médica. Los días en los que necesitabas prescripción médica para la píldora anticonceptiva han terminado. Opill está disponible en línea y en la mayoría de las tiendas. Toma el control de tu salud reproductiva con Opill. Usa el código BIRTHCONTROL y recibe 25% de descuento en tu primer mes de Opill en opill.com.
Buy it directly from the publisher. Please don't buy it from a gigantic, for legally reasons unnamed online mega retailer, because they've got enough money already. So buy it from your local guys because they need your help. Murray, it was a real pleasure today, and thank you so much, and all the very best.
Thanks very much, Nick. If you could let myself and Fiona know when this goes live, that'd be helpful for us.
Probably, yeah. Okay, I will do. Thank you for listening to this episode of Explaining History. This podcast is an independent production, and it's listener support that keeps these conversations going week after week. If you find value in the show and want to help cover the costs of research and production, please consider making a contribution. You can join our community on Patreon or make a one-off donation. Just follow the links in the show notes for this episode. Every bit of support is truly appreciated. Thanks again for listening.